Oh yeah, sure. Sorry. Peripheries of the word unite. This is the title of my talk. And today, AICA Congress is taking place in Košice, what reminds me Gyula Košice, an artist born here in 1924 and emigrated to Argentina 4 years later. He was a co-founder of the MADI group in Buenos Aires in the mid-1940s. They produce, the artists from the MADI group, they produce radical art, experimenting among others with the frame, something what years later was invented by Frank Stella as shaped canvas. While Stella's and other North American artists' experiments with frames are widely known and appreciated by the mainstream art history, Gyula Košice and his Argentine fellow artists remain relatively less recognized, especially by the general audience. You see. Although the MADI exhibited in Paris in 1948 as a part of the Le Salon des Réalités Nouvelles, French art criticism did not pay too much attention to them. Only in this year, 2013, something supposed to change in the former capital of modern art, since on the new permanent exhibition in Centre Pompidou, some paintings of the group are planning to be displayed. They are changing the permanent display in the Centre Pompidou this fall. Gyula Košice is not, of course, the only victim of the ignorance of the mainstream art history. This used to happen to many artists coming from peripheries, either it would be South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, Eastern and Northern and Southern Europe. Such an ignorance of peripheral art is, of course, a challenge for us, art historians who are especially sensitive for the art peripheries and who are seeking the methods to subvert and invert the mainstream art historical narratives, what actually is the topic of today's talk. In order to do it, I see two methodological approaches should be made at the same time, namely, first, deconstructive, and the second, constructive. The first, deconstructive, I would call after Dipesh Chakrabarty, provincializing West. That is, to see the West as one of many provinces or many peripheries. Of course, I'm not going to deprive the West from its artistic significance, rather to remove its hierarchical position from art historical narratives and to see it as one of many places in the world. If we examine, for example, surrealism, that would mean that not necessarily Paris might be seen as the only center or the capital of the movement. We could see Prague as an equal center either, or its other capital, as Derek Sayer claims in his wonderful book, which was published actually this fall, Prague, Capital of 20th Century. No one is going to remove André Breton from his art historical position, but I and other scholars on that field are going to recognize Jindřich Šterský as an equal artist to the former. The same could be said on Tadeusz Kantor and his happenings in comparison to Alan Kepro. Kantor, the artist living and working in the peripheral, so to speak, city of Krakow, the city actually not far from Košice. The second approach, which I called constructive, and which is not an alternative to the former, rather the parallel, is definitely more complex. And the question how to proceed in this way is the main topic of my today talk. In order to make non-hierarchical analysis, horizontal, as once I called it, we should select some crucial dates in world history and make critical examination around examination of art around that, art which is supposed to be a part of those processes. Since I have mentioned the MADI group before, as you see still on the screen, let's start with culture of the following World War II years. Of course, 1945, the end of the war, is quite important, but let's move a little bit forward to the end of the 1940s, actually 1947-48, when the MADI artists presented their art in Paris. So, circa 1947-48 is the beginning of political and cultural Stalinization of Eastern Europe, is the time of the beginning of real or formal monoparty system in Hungary and Poland, and the coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia, and at the same time leaving the Soviet zone, but not state socialism, by Yugoslavia. In one war, 1947-48 is the beginning of the Cold War. However, while in East European countries, socialist realism was introduced as the only acceptable art, in Yugoslavia, few years later, actually post-1951, we have been observing something different, socialist modernism. This is also the time of emerging the post-colonial and a neo-colonial world, marked by the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947. In India, in the framework of the political circumstances marked by the independence of the country, the Progressive Artists Group was founded. You see this group. It was founded actually in the office, in the office of the Friends of the Soviet Union, which referred to both the Bengal School in India, very influential, very important school, reviving, early in the 1920s, among others, reviving the local tradition, as well as Indian modernism emerged in the 1920s. It's mentioned 1922, and in Calcutta was an exhibition of Bauhaus artists. The progressives' version of modernism, which combined the local tradition with international modernity, was a part of this strategy of Indian cultural politics that time. This period was the moment when the apartheid system in South Africa was set up, 1947. Israel emerged as a new state in Palestine, 1948, as well as communist China in Asia, 1949, with its own version of socialist realism, which was different version of socialist realism that which was in the Soviet Union, although some of the Soviet artists, as Jogansen, for example, were strongly involved in introducing socialist realism in China. It is quite striking example how the socialist realism extended in the world. And it's also very interesting, and I've just learned that in 3 years the AICA Congress will be in Cuba. And when Cuba somehow joined the Soviet bloc, there was no socialist realism at all. In 1959, the artistic situation in Cuba was completely different. But that was, of course, 10 years later. On the other hand, we see North American strategy to create its cultural along with political hegemony by introducing abstract expressionism on the global scene. The Marshall Plan, which is supposed to prevent Western Europe, especially France and Italy, from the possible communist governments and the strong impact of American culture, mostly film industry, among others, on the old continent. Something as Serge Guilbeault called the stolen idea of modern art by New York. It's quite interesting to compare these processes with what's going on that time in Italy, for example, and the debate on realism and abstraction at the end of the 1940s. Thus, in terms of art, from circa 1947, the world was a scene of struggle between two the so-called universalist doctrines, socialist realism and abstract painting, which neither of them had a local ambition, rather quite global indeed, including the first, the second, and later on the so-called the third world. The best illustration of this process might be Egyptian art scene, where after the revolution a few years later, actually in 1952, and under Gamal Abdel Nasser's cultural politics, art, which combines both a local tradition with Western modernism, was supported as a vehicle of the presence of the country on the world art scene, among others on the international biennials, such as Venice Biennial in the 1950s. They did it, that is, they turned on the artistic interest towards the West, being at the same time anti-imperialist, that is, in conflict with the West and close to the Soviet bloc, what among others the nationalization of Suez Canal and its political background showed. Let's come closer to the story. In Western, actually North American narratives, abstract expressionism, or more generally speaking, non-geometrical abstraction, geometrical abstraction is a different story, has been perceived as the formative factor of worldwide modernism. Eva Cockcroft said, and I quote him, during the post-Stalinist era in 1956, when the Polish government under Gomułka became more liberal, Tadeusz Kantor, an artist from Krakow, impressed by the work of Pollock and other abstractionists which he had seen during an earlier trip to Paris, began to lead the movement away from socialist realism in Poland. In 1961, Kantor and 14 other non-objective Polish painters were given an exhibition at MoMA. Examples like this one, reflect the success of the political aims of the international programs of MoMA, end of quote. This is this exhibition what Marek mentioned in his first speech, actually. End of quote. Of course, Eva Cockcroft and above-mentioned Serge Guilbault did their contributions on the critical way in order to disclose the US imperialist policy. That will be Kantor right now. Nevertheless, to stress the decisive role of abstract expressionism in world art history and its possible influence over other countries, including above-mentioned Poland, but also Czechoslovakia by the end of the 1950s, is definitely misconception. To develop a little bit Kantor's case, as you see on the screen, mentioned by Cockcroft, let me add that Polish artists, as well as others from Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America, saw still Paris as the origin of modern art, the mythical capital of modernism, and not the US. Since we started, geographically speaking, from Argentina, let's have a look what was going on in the mid-1950s there in Argentina. Actually, one can find there are very interesting processes, somehow comparable to, on the horizontal level with those mentioned in Poland in the framework of post-Stalin era. Those two countries had been facing a sort of cultural modernization almost at the same time, namely in the mid-1950s. Similar geographically oriented points of origins, namely French, seen in somehow comparable political moments, that is, in the framework of a collapse of authoritarian systems, Peronism in Argentina, and Stalinism, but not communism, whatever we mean on communism, frankly speaking, in Poland. Art modernization in Argentina after Juan Domingo Perón removal from power resulted in reinforcing and reopening in 1957 in Buenos Aires the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes under the new directorship, namely famous Jorge Romero Brest, appointed at that position in 1956. Accompanied by founding the new Museum of Modern Art, Museo d'Arte Moderna, in 1956, and 2 years later, Instituto Torquato di Tella. There was a strong instrumentalization and internationalization of modernism there, as Andrea Giunta is arguing. In Poland, no museums were funded. But we can also observe such an institutionalization of modernism. Let's mention the second exhibition of modern art in one of the highest and most prestigious art institutions in Poland, that is Zachęta Gallery in Warsaw in 1957, followed by a very important contribution of Polish modern art in the highest official exhibition of socialist countries in Moscow in 1958, where, as the only delegation, Polish curators and officials decided to show modern, abstract art instead of socialist realism, as any other delegations did. This is a very interesting example. On the left, you see one of Polish artists, which was exhibited in 1958 in this, the highest official exhibition in the Soviet Union, international exhibition, Marczyński. And on the right, you see the satire, the Soviet satire. You know, this guy is saying that there's something wrong with the TV set, you know, showing Marczyński's painting, and he's going to repair it, coming back to the real picture. Of course, Peronism was not the same as Stalinism. Nevertheless, the broad acceptance of modernism almost at the same time after the fall of authoritarian regimes in the hard version, including conservative cultural policy as the reply to them, is quite striking. What should be stressed here is that both processes were French-oriented, what means that not the MoMA and New York, which supposed to steal the modern art, but still Paris were perceived as the point of origin of modernism, on the contrary to what Eva Cockcroft suggests. Even more, if we extend it for other countries in Eastern Europe, such as Czechoslovakia, and take into account both Prague and Bratislava confrontations exhibition and the end of the 1950s, we can see how Eva Cockcroft was wrong. Another worldwide horizontal cut could be 1968, and everything what was happening around the entire world, along with 1968. I'm not going into details. Obviously, results of these processes are crucial for contemporary culture, maybe the most crucial date. Let me mention only that almost everyone has its own 1968. However, in the world history, Paris May appears as the crucial. It's not necessary for us. Since we have our own 1968, in Poland, March 1968, and in Czechoslovakia, the so-called Prague Spring, which affected not only Prague, of course, but other cities as well. Not students' revolution was the core of historical processes in Eastern Europe, but the consequences of the Warsaw Pact invasion over Czechoslovakia. If we then take it as the point of departure of the dynamics of the Cold War, we would have a completely different picture of the post-war history, including art history, especially seen in political context. The normalization, that is, repressive processes following the invasion, means cultural restriction, lack of freedom, exile, stagnation, and all of that bad things Czechoslovakia was facing that time. But it also means something what Hugo de Martini joked, and I quote him. It was good thing that the Russian came, otherwise we would have become art professors and official artists, end of quote. This is of course a joke, but the more important point is how the artists did respond to the normalization. The most striking characteristic, and certainly not the only one, is a sort of minimalizing art actions and escaping from traditional art situations and forms. Let me recollect just two examples. One of them, actually my favorite, to the right, is Piwo w Umeni, or Beer in Art, by the group of Krzyżownicka Szkoła. The artists have been simply gathering in the restaurants or bars and drinking beer. The other, also minimalized as much as possible, is Jiří Kovenda's actions performed in the public space, such as streets and subway stations. You see on the left. Jiří Kovenda will be performed this today? Today, okay. He has simply stopped passers-by or impeded pedestrians' traffic and by extending his hands and blocking the passage. It was many art projects, so to speak, like that in the 1970s in Czech lands and Slovakia, both in towns and outdoors, in forests, fields, etc. The question is how and in what way they were political. Definitely, their political involvement was not direct. This sort of reaction to the Prague Spring, or rather to the Soviet invasion, on the one can find in Eastern Europe, in Hungary only, as far as such artists as Thomas Sentioby or Laszlo Lachner are concerned. In Czechoslovakia itself, it was something as the eloquent silence instead, a protest by minimal gestures showing that almost everything is banned under new political rules. In South America, let's still keep Argentina. These processes looked completely different. First of all, neither Prague Spring nor Paris May was on the agenda, but the dictatorship set up 2 years before in 1966. Actually, this year, where the AICA Congress was in Czechoslovakia. Since then, the political situation was harder and harder, and persecutions, bloody terror, was growing pretty fast. In this context, the art event called Thyssen is Burning in 1968 was organized first in Rosario, where it was open for a couple of weeks in the Workers' Union headquarters, and then in Buenos Aires Graphic Federation, just for 1 day, due to the strong reaction from the security police. Thyssen is one of the Argentine quite poor provinces, suffered at the end of the 1960s from deep economical crisis due to the closing small business in order to protect big sugar factories based on the international, read North American capital, resulted in huge unemployment, poverty, etc. The project dealt with the social and political situation there, especially with the situation of local working class. It was the exhibition showing lots of documentation, research, and materials concerning the social situation in the province. Frankly speaking, and this is the issue, it did not deal so much with art. Rather, it was a direct political action. In other words, it looks like art had been given up and gave way for direct political involvement. This is not only different strategy, but different philosophy of art. The background of such different attitudes in the position of modernism in those two regions this is the issue. Why in Eastern Europe, including Czechoslovakia, modernism, that is the autonomy of art, its self-referential character, social non-engagement, was recognized as the alternative to the mandatory socialist realism during Stalinism, in some countries even later, as the GDR, for example. That is, the system of values was perceived in fact in the political way opposing the power. So autonomy of art was something which really opposed the power and the official strategy, at least during the Stalinist years. In South Africa, modernism especially in the 1960s, and its value system was that time, 1960s, recognized as the tool of power, its strategy of surveillance and keeping distance from political critique. So, while in Eastern Europe, even the neo-avant-garde artists did continue modernist value system as the anti-power standpoint, Latin American ones gave it up in order to be directly involved in politics. This is quite interesting subject for comparative art history of different peripheries. So there are two different situations. This is why South American artists completely gave up modernism and went to the political involvement, and still in Eastern Europe they kept the autonomy of art in order to still be against communism, let's say, or its political cultural policies. However, in different countries it meant different things. Now let's come to the last comparative historical moment as the platform of such a worldwide analysis in terms of creating peripheral approach to art history. It's of course 1989, the end of the Cold War, the beginning of real globalization. It's a real challenge for art history, resulted among others a discussion on the global art history and a chance for peripheries. I'm not going to take part in this debate in the debate on global art history at that moment. Rather, I would like to discuss the political background behind calling it alter globalist art history, or alter globalist art criticism, if you like, since we are at the Congress of Art Criticism. In order to undermine the mainstream art historical discourse, dominant, master, etc., and to give way peripheral art narratives, let me refer to Hans Belting's approach to art history as the case study, and to begin with his idea of the end of art history. The end of art history, what means the end of the autonomous sphere based on mostly on the Renaissance model of art and later Kantian aesthetic, a history of art usually separated from other knowledge, such as especially cultural anthropology. He did not claim for the end of art studies as such, but said that what we have been doing up till then, namely traditionally understood art history, is not sufficient to understand art and its past, not only contemporary art, but also its past. Developing that way of thinking and observing contemporary art scene, he has been arguing that global art is at the same time both post-historical, since Western art historical methodology is not useful in analyzing it, and post-ethnic, since the same we can say about Western ethnography. Developing the large project Global Art and the Museum, G&M, held in CKM, Karlsruhe, resulted in the exhibition The Global Contemporary, you see the poster, The Global Contemporary Art Awards after 1989, and a couple of publications along with it. His point of departure was a belief that global art is very different from the notion of contemporary art we had some decades before. According to Belting, the most important impact that breaks modernist concept of art and creates the new one comes from the peripheries, mostly from the former Third World, now the Global South. It has, of course, resulted in abolishing distinctions between ethnology and art history, as I said before. At the same time, Belting differentiates world art from the global art, and consequently, world art studies from global art history. While the first, world art studies, while the first deals with the world cultural heritage and the idea of modern universalism as the most famous and perhaps also the most comprehensive project on that field, that is John Annion's Atlas of World Art shows. The latter, Global Art History, is based on the post-ethnic and post-historical attitudes. In one word, it is neither truly ethnic nor truly artistic in European traditional art historical terms, since, firstly, not a self-expression of ethnicity, rather self-performance is the artist's strategy from the global south. And secondly, this art does not operate with such categories as form, style, originality, rather the heterogeneity of new media, transparent character, collective work, etc., etc., etc. I would develop this vocabulary and say that as we can call modern / postmodern world art history globalist, the new, critical to the previous one, I would name alter globalist art history. What is then, according to Belting, global art history, or in our terminology, alter globalist art history? It's definitely not world art studies, as it has been mentioned before, but also it cannot be understood as a history of global art in terms of Belting. Of course, it shouldn't be interpreted as a neoliberal offer to newcomers, as the version of neocolonialism or the empire, neither, or postmodern differentiation, what Igor Zabel wrote about some years ago, many years ago. Unfortunately, Belting did not give us any systematic answer for this question. What he proposed instead, and what he even did before in the above-mentioned book, Das Ende der Kunstgeschichte, it is an idea of the end of art history understood as traditional academic discipline operating with traditional analytical and theoretical concepts based on the Renaissance understanding of art. Of course, we can say that the previous Belting scholarship, such as especially Bild Anthropologie, deals with it too. However, let me stress his more recent study, namely Florence und Baghdad. You see the cover of his book here, Florence und Baghdad. It's also in English, available in English and French, actually. It shows how the Arab knowledge is behind Western perspective. The foundation of Western perspective, Renaissance perspective, the foundation of Western classical art understanding, and plays an important role in terms of undermining Western egocentrism and cultural hegemony, as well as recent anti-Islamic hysteria in the West. Belting shows the mutual relation between cultures deprived from hegemony, whether it would be Western or Arabic, and not, as it has been showing in the infamous Samuel Huntington's book, Clash of Civilization. This is a truly alter-globalist approach to history, and at the same time, a possible background for the slogan used in the title of this talk, Peripheries of the World Unite. Now, concluding this talk, let me draw briefly a sort of political prospect that could be found on this background, on the background of alter-globalist art history. Let me begin with quoting Krzysztof Wodiczko, who at the end of his text, which was at the same time a project of 9/11 monument to make New York the city of refugee. The project to make the New York as a city of refugee, this is from Bible, of course, this concept coming from Bible, is a sort of monument for 9/11. So not to erect the monument, but just to make the city of refugee, according to Wodiczko, supposed to be or should be a monument to 9/11. He said, and at the end of his text, after post-structuralism, I'll quote him, after post-structuralism, it is now time for self-reconstruction toward new visions and constructions, political, social, and cultural, envisaging and designing new, engaging, inclusive, agonistic memorial projects must become part of this emancipator agenda, end of quote. This is a clear voice for a utopia. The other voice is coming from Immanuel Wallenstein, or Wallenstein if you like, who suggests that instead of a utopia, we should talk on utopistics. Generally speaking, it means that a utopia is just an idea, while utopistics is the analysis of social, political, economic, or cultural situation in order to create the most possible prospects for the future. In other words, while the first is an idealistic vision of the future, the latter is a real possibility based on scientific and scholarly research of the so-called world system in the Longue Durée project. He is arguing thus that now we are at the turning point of the world economy, facing the end of the old one and emerging something new. How the future would look like, what it could be, there is of course not definite answers for that, but somehow it depends on us, says Wallenstein. Although the distinction between a utopia, idealism, and utopistics, rationalism, is not entirely clear for me, and Wallenstein's argument, especially when he is talking about the future, looks speculative, I'm sure that we can do something in order to change the world, or at least to understand it in order to give way for alter globalis project. To study art peripheries, whether understood in terms of geography or social and political relations, to study geohistorical margins or marginalized countries, as well as developing critical approach, whether it would come from the power knowledge system located in the former West or former East or global South, or as well, it is the right way to create alter globalist attitudes to the present world system with its mainstream narratives. I'm sure that studying peripheries, that is, white places and black holes, as the slogan of this present Congress says, is an important step towards new understanding and organizing the world. It is why we need a sort of peripheral international and a banner with the motto, Peripheries of the World Unite. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and strong comparative lecture. First of all, between the Western modernism and the modernism, the other part of the world. And thank you very much for idealistic utopia, for peripheria. And
thank you for commenting this.
Yes. And now I suppose I think you inspire us for questions. Yes? I didn't say.
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
I just wanted to comment that I find this extremely important and informative, but I just wanted to make a mention that I really, coming from that alien planet called the USA, I just wanted to say
Don't worry
that,
about so much.
but I just wanted to say that in my training, I never was taught that modernism that was invented in the US, we have always acknowledged that if it was not for all the Europeans coming to the US to flee the Holocaust, we would never have the richness of modernism because of the, you could say, the Bauhaus, artists from France, artists from other areas, Moholy-Nagy, fleeing Europe and bringing the language of modernism to our country. And then the other thing I was going to say in dialogue was the criticality of the situation because of the demise of Europe, the destruction. And if it was not for, because prior to abstract expressionism, nobody cared about modern art in the United States. And it was that formalist, Clement Greenberg, an art critic, who was the one, and Rosenberg, who just really championed modernism. And I think recently the Museum of Modern Art has begun to acknowledge the criticality of the many artists from all over the world who were working either prior or in a similar way, because 2 years ago we just had that big exhibition on re-examining the language of abstraction. So I think the revision of revisionism of the artists, as well as, you could say, going back to the origins, is beginning. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much for this comment, and I comment this comment. Just two artists from Europe did not only go to North America, but also to South America, for example. There was a pretty interesting and large emigration from Europe to South America. And unfortunately, what we used to be learned from the mainstream art history, it's only North American artists there. If we take into account, for example, a huge book which is supposed to extend the geographical area as the art since 1900, published by the people connected with the October group, is not so many artists from, the other places, black holes, let's say, that from the West. So still the problem exists. This is the first comment. The second comment, yes, that's true. The MoMA, for a couple of years, started to change the orientation, and now they have very interesting project indeed called MAP, which is actually devoted to non-Western art milieus and some particular actually questions in art. In Brazil, this is connected with concretism in Brazil. In Eastern Europe, what means fluxus East, and I guess Japan, but I don't remember, maybe happening something like this. So you're right, they are changing, and this exhibition of abstract expressionism show this, but also they are changing on the much deeper, profound way. For example, introducing some research projects, frankly speaking. And this Fluxus, for example, project at MoMA, it comes from donation of huge collection of Fluxus East to the MoMA. So this is combining both the museum job and the scholarship. So thank you very much for this. Yeah, Susanna.
Susanna Bartuszeva, je parlerai français, j'espère que c'est pas une question pour les membres de AICA.
Yes, I will speak in French. I hope it's okay
Je voudrais seulement
for
dire
AICA,
une
for
petite
participants. I would
note.
just like to
Ça veut
say
dire que la charte
that
77
the
était fondée par
Charter
aussi plusieurs des
was
artistes, si on accepte que les écrivains, les dramatiques,
and founded not only by artists but also writers and other artists, designers, not just visual artists. Yes, we talk about visual arts here first of all, but we should also remember that there were other artists involved, Czech artists who in the 1970s also were part of these activities. And then as regards the activities of Slovak visual artists during the Velvet Revolution itself, well, we remember them very well, those of us who lived here.
Absolutely acknowledge and appreciate Slovak artists which to my knowledge, the Slovak art scene at the end of the 1960s, as well as on the beginning of the 1970s, was different than the Czech one. And you know, we can find many differences, you know, between them. But you are the expert of this. Thank you very much.
The others? Please.
You. No. I shout. You refer. You referred to John O'Nien's World Art Studies. Can you just differentiate more the difference in that project than your alter globalist?
Yeah.
Thanks.
It's actually a remark made by Belting. The O'Nien's atlas, a huge one, was, according to him, and I agree with him, an example of a way of thinking about the world art studies, which means that time a sort of heritage, cultural heritage, which produced, maybe not necessary in John O'Nien's atlas, but generally speaking, produces two important factors. First, it says that world heritage should be protected as the universalist tradition of contemporary world. This is the first, but the second one is more complicated. It's as many scholars did. For example, studying the museum business, as for example, Carol Duncan. They show that this world heritage is implemented, it's incorporated in the particular narrative, which is, frankly speaking, Western narrative. She did it while analyzing the Louvre exhibition and collection, for example. And also this sort of approach is used by some scholars on the museum studies, which are strongly against what we are calling new museology or critical museum studies, a sort of conservative reaction to this in order to protect world collection in the museums, huge museums like British Museum, for example, the Louvre or something like this, and who are against sort of claiming by the country of origins to give it up back, saying, okay, this is the world heritage, so-called universalist heritage, and we have, I mean they have, to protect them, but in their own institutions, which are in the centers of neoliberal world, let's say. So this is what I mean. What, frankly speaking, I'm developing what Belting meant world art studies. So this studies, not history, means that the relationship between particular production, which is a part of the heritage, world heritage, is not examined, is not analyzed in historical context, but non-historical context as the spiritual heritage. The global art history, or as to me, outer globalist history, is first of all historical studies. So constructing a sort of relationship between particular art production or art-like production with in particular context. I would call this critical geography at the same time, or relational geography, trying to discover the particular relation with the object and the context. So this is the generally speaking differences between them. The first is much more spiritual landscape of The word heritage, ahistorical, however, John Ananias will be angry with me if I said like this. But now he left, as you know, this sort of studies, and he's going more to neuro art history. It's a pretty interesting challenge for art history, the other one than the global art history. So the first is like this, and the second is more historical, more contextual analysis. Thanks.
Thank you. It's second lecture.